The night was alive with lights and music, the kind of music that seemed to float above the heads of everyone in the grand hall. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting warm reflections across the polished marble floors. The city stretched beyond the huge glass windows, a sea of lights twinkling like stars. Guests moved gracefully through the room, dressed in elegant gowns and tailored suits, carrying glasses of sparkling champagne. Every corner seemed to hum with quiet conversations, laughter, and the occasional clink of glasses. The billionaire was a man who commanded attention, even without trying. Tall, well-dressed, and composed, he moved through the crowd with a calm authority. He spoke in soft tones, but there was a weight behind his words that made people listen. Many had tried to impress him, to get a single nod or a hint of approval, but few had succeeded. Tonight was one of those rare occasions when he was entertaining guests at his penthouse, a space so luxurious that every detail spoke of wealth and power. Among the crowd of well-known faces, there was a servant who moved quietly, unnoticed by most. He carried trays with drinks and food, ensuring that glasses never ran empty and that everyone had what they needed. But his eyes were always observing. He noticed the small gestures of people, the quick glance at a neighbor, the subtle nod, the nervous fidget. He had learned over the years that much more was said in gestures than in words. He had worked for the billionaire for many years and had seen countless social events, but he understood something that few others did. He understood the way the room worked, the invisible currents that moved among the guests, the way power was measured not just by wealth but by presence and perception. As the evening progressed, the billionaire called for attention. The music softened, and the guests turned toward him expecting some announcement or a toast. He spoke in Arabic, a language that was beautiful and commanding, yet completely foreign to most of the people in the room. There was a hush as everyone tried to catch the rhythm and the tone, hoping that even if they did not understand the words, they could understand the meaning through expression. Some nodded politely, others smiled in acknowledgement, but there was a clear tension. No one wanted to appear ignorant or inattentive. The servant, however, did not merely observe. He listened carefully, catching nuances in the billionaire's words, recognizing subtle hints and implications that others could not. He understood the language, of course, but more than that, he understood the intent, the unspoken message behind each phrase. He knew that the billionaire was testing the room, seeing who would respond with thoughtfulness rather than just noise. The guests remained silent, uncertain of what to say, each person calculating whether to speak or remain quiet. It was not arrogance that held them back. It was fear. Fear of saying the wrong thing, of embarrassing themselves in front of someone so powerful. They had all learned the rules of such gatherings. Speak too soon and you risk appearing foolish. Remain silent, and you may miss an opportunity to show insight. The room was thick with this tension, as the silence in the room had stretched long enough that it felt almost impossible to move without disturbing the tension that hung like a heavy fog. Guests were now fully aware of the weight of the moment, their polite expressions strained and uneven. They had all felt the pause in conversation, each glance, each shift in posture magnified in the quiet. No one dared speak. No one dared act. The billionaire's calm gaze seemed to weigh each of them, silently questioning their readiness, their insight, their courage. It was a delicate balance, and everyone knew that a single misstep could shatter it. The servant had been waiting, aware of every second passing in the grand room. He had watched the expressions of the guests, noting the polite confusion and forced smiles. He had seen the subtle panic creeping into the movements of those who had previously been confident, and he had heard the billionaire's words in Arabic, the rhythm and meaning of each phrase echoing in his mind. He knew that now was the moment to act, but he remained composed, understanding that clarity and precision were essential. He did not seek attention. He did not seek praise. He only sought to speak the truth and convey the meaning with honesty. With a steady breath, he finally spoke. The sound of his voice broke the silence like a gentle ripple through still water. He spoke in fluent Arabic, responding directly to the billionaire's words. His tone was calm, deliberate, and thoughtful. Every syllable was clear, every sentence precise, every word infused with understanding. The guests froze, some leaning slightly forward in disbelief, some sinking back in stunned silence. Their whispered guesses and nervous glances had vanished entirely. The room had been silenced by something unexpected, something more powerful than wealth or status. The billionaire's eyes softened, a subtle smile appearing at the corner of his mouth. It was not a broad smile, but there was warmth in it, a quiet approval that carried a sense of satisfaction and respect. The billionaire listened intently, nodding slightly as the servant's words unfolded. The meaning was clear, the insight sharp, the courage evident. The servant had not spoken to impress. He had spoken to convey truth, and in doing so he had commanded attention in a way that no display of wealth or status could achieve. Guests were unable to hide their astonishment. Their eyes widened, their mouths slightly parted in surprise. They had all assumed that someone of the servant's position would remain silent, that he would follow the expected role of service without stepping beyond it. They had assumed wrong. The realization struck them like a sudden wave. They had underestimated him. They had misjudged him. And in that moment, the power dynamic in the room shifted imperceptibly but unmistakably. The servant had claimed a place of authority through knowledge, courage, and clarity. The billionaire's gaze met the servant's, and there was a quiet exchange that no one else in the room could fully understand. It was a moment of recognition, of shared understanding. The billionaire had spoken in Arabic to test, to measure, and the servant had met that test with insight and honesty. There was no boastfulness, no arrogance, only the quiet demonstration of understanding and integrity, and it was enough to silence everyone else. Whispers began to ripple through the room, low murmurs that quickly died down when the billionaire's eyes swept over the crowd. The guests were aware that they had been caught in their ass. The moment after the servant spoke lingered longer than anyone expected. The room had shifted in ways subtle but unmistakable. The tension that had dominated the evening began to transform into a quiet reflection. Guests moved slowly, as if trying to adjust to the new reality created by the servant's words. They were no longer the confident, composed figures who had walked into the penthouse earlier. They were thoughtful, humbled, and attentive. The impact of one voice had altered the entire atmosphere. The billionaire, standing with his characteristic calmness, surveyed the room. He had achieved exactly what he intended. His words had been more than a simple statement. They were a test, a measure of awareness and insight. And now that test had been answered with clarity, honesty, and courage. The silent acknowledgement between him and the servant conveyed more than words could express. It was a mutual recognition of understanding and respect, built on years of observation and quiet intelligence. Guests began to speak again, but differently this time. The casual, sometimes shallow conversations that had filled the room earlier were replaced with measured dialogue. People asked questions, listened attentively, and offered opinions with a newfound thoughtfulness. The lessons of humility and observation were not lost on anyone. Whispers of admiration for the servant began to circulate quietly, but more than that, there was an understanding that intelligence and courage were not dictated by social standing or appearance. The servant continued his work with the same quiet efficiency, yet now the eyes of many guests followed him in subtle acknowledgement. He was no longer invisible, but he did not act differently. He did not seek validation or recognition. His focus remained on performing his duties well, while understanding that his words had already made a lasting impression. It was a demonstration of humility paired with quiet authority, a combination that left a mark on the room that could not easily be erased. Small interactions began to shift as well. Guests who had previously whispered and exchanged anxious glances now engaged more openly, their tone softer, their demeanor more genuine. There was an unspoken lesson that had been absorbed. Respect must be earned, and true insight is recognized by those who value clarity and honesty. The atmosphere, once heavy and tense, began to feel more authentic, more human. People were no longer acting merely to impress. They were listening, thinking, and responding with intention. The billionaire, observing these subtle shifts, seemed quietly satisfied. The evening had taken on a deeper meaning than a social gathering or a display of wealth and power. It had become a lesson in humility, courage, and awareness. He did not need to intervene or explain. The impact of his words, coupled with the servant's response, had communicated the message more powerfully than any direct instruction could have. The servant's interactions with guests were small, but significant. When he passed trays, offered a glass of water, or adjusted a chair, there was a sense of dignity. The evening had gradually wound down. Yet the memory of the servant's words continued to linger in the penthouse. Guests were leaving one by one, each carrying a sense of reflection with them. There was a quiet energy in the room now. different from the tension that had defined the earlier hours. People spoke with more thought, moved with a softer awareness, and carried a newfound understanding that knowledge and courage are not defined by titles, appearances, or social roles. The billionaire remained in the room, speaking quietly to a few trusted associates, yet his attention often returned to the servant. There was a respect in his eyes, subtle but unmistakable, for someone who had understood the depth of his words and responded with insight and integrity. The servant continued his duties quietly, adjusting chairs, collecting trays, and ensuring the room was orderly. He moved with grace and calm, aware that his influence had quietly changed the energy of the entire gathering. Guests who had once whispered anxiously to each other now shared thoughtful remarks about the evening. Many reflected on their own assumptions and behaviors, realizing how easily they had underestimated someone based solely on their role or appearance. The lessons of humility, courage, and awareness were sinking in. The impact of one quiet, intelligent voice had reshaped perceptions in a room full of wealth and status. The servant, though unassuming, had become a symbol of integrity and clarity. People who had previously ignored him now found themselves paying subtle attention, not to him as a figure of service, but to the intelligence and character he had displayed. He had demonstrated that true respect is earned, not given, and that wisdom can emerge from places often overlooked by society. The ripple of that realization extended beyond the penthouse walls, leaving guests with a perspective that would linger long after the event. The days following the grand event were quiet, yet the impact of that night lingered in the minds of everyone who had attended. Guests returned to their daily lives, but the memory of the servant's words and the manner in which he had spoken them remained vivid. For many, it became a benchmark against which they measured their own behavior, their assumptions, and the respect they extended to others. The servant's courage had created ripples far beyond the walls of the penthouse. The billionaire, too, reflected on the event in a more private way. He considered not just the immediate reaction of the guests, but the broader lessons that had been revealed. Wealth and status can create a perception of influence, but true understanding and respect come from insight, integrity, and the willingness to act with clarity. The servant had demonstrated these qualities with calm composure, and the billionaire appreciated the subtlety and depth of that demonstration. Back at the penthouse, the servant went about his daily duties as he always had. He moved through the spaces with quiet grace, attending to the needs of the billionaire and the staff, adjusting arrangements, and performing tasks with the same steady precision. Yet there was a subtle shift in how he was perceived. Staff members, who had often interacted with him without much attention, now approached him with subtle nods, small acknowledgments of respect. They were aware of what had transpired, aware of the intelligence and courage he had displayed, and it had changed their perception of him. Guests who returned to their own social circles shared stories of the event, though often with discretion. They spoke of the servant in hushed admiration, of the quiet authority and insight he had displayed. There was a growing recognition that appearances could be misleading, that intelligence and courage were not limited to positions of visible power. The ripple effect continued, extending far beyond that single night, shaping interactions, and prompting reflection on assumptions and biases. In the penthouse, the billionaire began to rely on the servant in subtler, more meaningful ways. He sought his observations on minor decisions, valued his quiet insights during discussions, and trusted his judgment in moments when clarity was needed. This trust was not ostentatious or public. It was private, measured, and genuine. It was a recognition that the servant's insight carried value beyond the traditional roles assigned by society or expectation. The weeks that followed were filled with subtle but meaningful changes in the environment surrounding the billionaire and his gatherings. Though the social events continued, there was a distinct shift in the way people interacted. Guests were no longer concerned solely with appearance, status, or impressing those around them. Conversations became more reflective, deliberate, and genuine. The memory of the servant's calm, insightful response in Arabic had become a quiet benchmark for integrity, courage, and understanding. The servant himself continued to move through the penthouse with the same composed, respectful manner he always had. He attended to guests and staff, adjusted settings, and ensured that everything ran smoothly. Yet, unlike before, his presence was quietly acknowledged by all. There were subtle nods, respectful gestures, and occasional glances of admiration. These acknowledgments were not requested, nor were they necessary. They were a natural recognition of the quiet authority he had earned the night he spoke. People had come to understand that respect is gained through action and insight rather than position. The billionaire observed these changes with quiet satisfaction. He recognized the ripple effect the servant had created, how a single act of courage and clarity could reshape social dynamics and even alter behavior in the long term. The evening had proven that genuine insight could not be overlooked, that intelligence and moral strength could transcend traditional hierarchies, and that even those considered invisible could hold profound influence. The billionaire began to think more deliberately about the way he conducted events, focusing on creating environments that encouraged authentic engagement and reflection. Conversations among guests began to reflect a deeper level of awareness. Attendees who had once relied on appearances and polite gestures to navigate social situations now spoke with more authenticity and humility. They shared personal reflections, posed thoughtful questions, and listened with genuine attention. The servant's example had silently guided them, illustrating how courage and integrity could command attention and respect far more effectively than pretense or status. Staff members, too, had been impacted. The example set by the servant became a quiet teaching point, demonstrating how composure, attentiveness, and insight could influence both guests and the broader environment. Others began to adopt more thoughtful approaches in their own work, learning to observe closely, act with precision, and recognize the importance of understanding and patience. His example was not prescriptive, it was inspirational, encouraging reflection and growth in ways that were subtle yet profound. Meanwhile, the servant's own reflection was calm and centered. He had not sought recognition, yet he understood the value of his actions. By speaking with honesty, clarity, and courage, he had not only fulfilled the immediate need but had also established a precedent for future interactions. He recognized that influence is rarely loud or demanding. It is quiet, consistent, and built on a foundation of integrity and insight. His sense of purpose was reinforced by the knowledge that his actions had lasting consequences, and that he had positively shaped the environment around him. The billionaire, aware of the long-term effects, began to engage more intentionally with the servant, not in a way that elevated him above others or changed his role, but in ways that valued his perspective and insight. He sought the servant's opinions in subtle matters, trusted his observations during events, and considered his input when decisions required careful judgment. The respect was mutual. The servant remained grounded, understanding that the power he now held came from consistent wisdom, not any formal title. Guests, now more aware and thoughtful, also began to interact differently with one another. They noticed the small gestures, the attentiveness to detail, and the courage to act with integrity. These qualities became points of reflection in conversations, often referenced without naming the servant directly. People recognize that genuine insight and moral clarity often come from unexpected places, and they began to examine their own assumptions and biases. The lesson of humility was reinforced daily, as the ripple effect of one courageous voice continued to manifest. The penthouse itself, a place of grandeur and elegance, had begun to feel more alive with thoughtfulness and reflection. Its grandeur was no longer just a backdrop for display, but a setting for meaningful interaction, observation, and growth. The servant's quiet presence and the respect he had earned subtly reshaped the atmosphere. Guests sensed it even if they could not name it, understanding intuitively that wisdom and courage carried more weight than wealth or appearance. Over time, the servant found moments of quiet reflection. He recognized that his influence was subtle but far-reaching. People were listening more, thinking more carefully, and acting with more integrity. This quiet change reinforced his understanding that leadership and respect do not always require overt action. Sometimes a single, well-timed act of courage and clarity can leave an enduring impact. The servant's calm observation and the wisdom he displayed had become a guidepost, shaping not just the immediate environment, but the broader social culture surrounding the billionaire and his events. The billionaire, reflecting on the evolving environment, considered the broader implications of the servant's example. It became clear that environments shaped by insight and integrity would naturally elevate thoughtful voices and actions. The servant's influence had revealed the power of humility, courage, and clarity in reshaping perceptions and interactions. The billionaire began to incorporate these insights into future gatherings, encouraging authentic dialogue and reflection, creating spaces where insight and moral clarity were more valued than appearances or pretense. The guest experience transformed as well. Attendees who had once viewed events as opportunities to impress now approached them with greater thoughtfulness and attention. They listened more carefully, asked more meaningful questions, and engaged with respect for each person's perspective. The influence of one courageous voice had become a quiet standard, guiding behavior and expectations even without overt instruction. As the weeks continued, the lessons of that night remained evident. The servant's influence, subtle yet pervasive, inspired reflection and growth in others. Staff members approached their work with greater attention. Guests engaged in deeper conversation, and the billionaire observed the development of an environment that valued insight, clarity, and integrity above status or appearance. The social fabric of the gatherings had shifted, demonstrating the quiet power of wisdom and moral courage. The servant continued his role with calm dedication. He remained attentive, precise, and observant, understanding that his influence was measured not by recognition, but by the ongoing impact of his actions and words. He had spoken at the right moment with clarity and courage, and the consequences of that single act were still unfolding. This understanding reinforced his sense of purpose and his quiet confidence, rooted not in status or acclaim, but in the integrity and insight he consistently demonstrated. The billionaire, too, remained attentive. He recognized the servant's consistent value, not through public acknowledgement, but through subtle engagement and trust. Decisions were influenced by observations and advice grounded in insight, and the environment of the penthouse continued to evolve into a space where intelligence, courage, and integrity were naturally recognized and respected. The ripple effect of that moment continued beyond the immediate gatherings. Stories circulated quietly among extended social and professional circles, emphasizing the importance of observation, humility, and courage. The servant became a quiet exemplar, a reminder that influence is not dependent on formal authority, but on consistent integrity and thoughtful action. Those who witnessed the event or heard of it reflected on their own assumptions and behaviors, often changing their approach to social and professional interactions. Even long after the specific events, the lessons remained. Guests approached interactions with a sense of attentiveness and reflection. Staff acted with greater care, and the atmosphere of the penthouse evolved into a space where insight and integrity were inherently valued. The memory of the servant's words continued to guide behavior, reminding everyone that courage and clarity can shift perceptions, reshape interactions, and leave lasting impacts. And so, the story of that night endured. One voice, spoken with insight, integrity, and courage, had subtly reshaped the world around it. The servant remained humble and focused, aware that true influence comes not from recognition, but from consistent, thoughtful action. The billionaire, guests, and staff all carried the quiet lesson forward, demonstrating that wisdom, courage, and integrity leave echoes far beyond the moment of their expression. The environment, transformed by one courageous voice, continued to thrive on observation, respect, and understanding, showing that the impact of clarity and moral strength is enduring and profound. The servant, for his part, remained grounded. He did not change his demeanor, did not seek recognition or reward. His satisfaction came from understanding, from the quiet knowledge that he had acted correctly and with integrity. He had been given an opportunity to speak, and he had done so with courage and clarity. The respect he received was a byproduct of that act, not a goal. He understood that true influence is often subtle and indirect, flowing from consistent character and thoughtful action rather than loud declaration. Visitors to the penthouse began to notice the subtle shift in dynamics. The servant's presence commanded attention not through authority or assertiveness, but through quiet competence and the lingering memory of his words. Guests were more attentive, more careful in their assumptions, and more respectful in their interactions. The lesson of the evening had been absorbed and internalized, leaving a lasting impression on the social fabric of the gatherings that followed. In conversations among the staff, the servant's example became a reference point. They discussed his calmness under pressure, his ability to observe and understand, and the courage it had taken to speak when others remained silent. These discussions were not about him seeking praise, but about understanding the qualities that made his actions remarkable. There was a quiet inspiration, a subtle encouragement for others to reflect on their own behavior and assumptions. The billionaire continued to host events, but the dynamic of his gatherings had evolved. He observed with greater attention the interactions of guests, the subtle gestures, and the moments of insight that often went unnoticed. He encouraged reflection and genuine conversation, understanding that the true value of social gatherings was not in display or spectacle, but in the revelation of character, courage, and understanding. The servant's words had been a catalyst for this change, a demonstration of the quiet power that insight and courage can have. In the broader circles connected to the billionaire, stories of the event circulated quietly. Business partners, associates, and distant acquaintances spoke with admiration about the servant, about his composure and intelligence, and about the way a single voice had changed the atmosphere of an entire room. It became a lesson in humility and awareness, a reminder that assumptions based on role or appearance are often flawed. The memory of that night served as a guide for many, shaping behavior and perception in subtle but meaningful ways. The servant himself continued to act with the same calm attention he always had. He understood that his role was not to dominate but to support, observe, and act with clarity when necessary. Yet his influence had grown, not through overt authority, but through the quiet strength of his character and the courage to speak when the moment demanded it. His words had demonstrated that integrity and insight can command respect and shape perception without the need for titles or status. As weeks passed, the ripple effects of the servant's actions were evident in multiple layers of the social and professional environment surrounding the penthouse. Guests interacted with greater awareness, staff approached their work with a deeper sense of observation, and the billionaire's gatherings became spaces of thoughtful engagement rather than displays of wealth. The lessons of humility, insight, and courage continued to resonate, creating a subtle but lasting transformation in the culture of those who had witnessed it. The servant reflected on these developments quietly. He did not take credit, nor did he seek acknowledgement. He recognized that his actions had consequences beyond the immediate moment, that the courage to speak with clarity could shape perceptions and behavior in lasting ways. This understanding brought him a quiet satisfaction, a sense of purpose that went beyond the tasks of daily work. The billionaire, observing the servant and the evolving dynamics, felt a sense of affirmation. He had seen countless people attempt to assert influence, but few had done so with such integrity and insight. The servant had demonstrated a depth of character that could not be measured by status or role. It was a reminder that true strength lies not in position or appearance, but in understanding, courage, and the ability to act with clarity and honesty. As the days continued, the lessons of that night remained alive in subtle ways. Guests and associates carried the memory of the servant's words, integrating the principles of humility, awareness, and courage into their own behavior. The servant continued his work with quiet efficiency, yet the respect and admiration he had earned lingered, a testament to the enduring power of insight and integrity. And so the story of that night remained a quiet, living lesson. One voice, spoken with courage and clarity, had the power to transform perceptions, reshape interactions, and leave a lasting imprint on all who witnessed it. The servant's calm, thoughtful presence and the wisdom he shared had proven that influence is not always loud, and respect is not always given. They are earned through insight, courage, and integrity, leaving echoes that resonate far beyond a single moment or place. The billionaire, noticing these changes, allowed himself a small smile. He had witnessed countless gatherings, countless attempts by people to impress and assert influence, but few moments had been as revealing as this one. The servant had quietly upended expectations, proving that insight and courage are forces more powerful than wealth, status, or pretense. It was a subtle reminder that the measure of a person lies in their integrity, understanding, and willingness to act with clarity when it matters most. Conversations among the guests began to shift toward deeper topics. They discussed ideas, philosophies, and personal reflections rather than trivial matters. The earlier tension had transformed into a shared sense of awareness. The memory of the servant's response served as a quiet guide for these discussions, a reminder that listening, observation, and honesty matter more than trying to impress others with superficial knowledge. The servant continued his work, ever attentive, ever composed. He did not seek accolades, yet he had earned the silent admiration of everyone present. His actions, coupled with his words earlier in the evening, had demonstrated the profound influence of humility, clarity, and courage. He had reminded the guests, subtly yet unmistakably, that intelligence and moral strength are often invisible until revealed through action. The billionaire quietly acknowledged the servant one final time before the guest departed. It was a look, filled with mutual understanding, respect, and an unspoken agreement that the servant's insight had changed more than just the evening. It had left a lasting mark on the dynamics of the room and the minds of those who witnessed it. The power of one thoughtful, courageous voice had become evident to all, a lesson in integrity and awareness that would resonate long beyond this single night. As the last guests left, the servant moved through the room, performing his duties with the same calm efficiency. Yet the presence he carried was different now. No longer invisible in the way that comes from expectation and routine, he had become a quiet anchor of wisdom and courage. The room, now silent in preparation for closure, seemed to acknowledge him in a subtle but profound way. His words and actions had demonstrated that influence is not always loud or ostentatious, and that respect earned through integrity resonates deeper than any display of status. The billionaire finally allowed himself to step back, reflecting on the evening. It had been more than a social gathering. It had been a lesson in perception, courage, and humility. The servant's role had transcended the ordinary tasks of service, demonstrating the profound impact of insight and moral clarity. The billionaire recognized the quiet power in such moments, knowing that true respect and understanding are cultivated through patience, observation, and courageous action. The lessons of the evening extended beyond the penthouse, beyond the immediate gathering. Guests would carry the memory of the servant's words and actions into their daily lives, re-evaluating assumptions, reconsidering biases, and reflecting on the true meaning of respect and influence. The ripple effect of courage, integrity, and clarity had begun, and it would continue quietly, subtly, shaping interactions and perceptions in ways that were not immediately visible, but deeply felt. The servant returned to his quarters later that night, exhausted from the long hours yet calm in spirit. He reflected on the events with quiet satisfaction, knowing that the evening had been more than just a performance of social etiquette. It had been a demonstration of what is possible when observation, knowledge, and courage intersect. He understood the lasting effect of his actions, not as a display of pride, but as a quiet fulfillment of responsibility and understanding. The billionaire, in his own private reflection, considered the impact of the evening. Wealth and influence can command attention, but they cannot create understanding or courage. These qualities must come from within, and when expressed, they resonate far beyond the moment of action. The servant had provided a living example of this truth, leaving a lasting impression that extended beyond social expectations and into the realm of genuine human respect. In the days that followed, guests who had attended the event spoke of it differently. Conversations referenced the evening not for the opulence or status on display, but for the profound lesson in awareness and courage. The servant's words became a quiet legend among the guests, a demonstration of the enduring power of clarity, insight, and integrity. It was a story told with humility and reflection, a reminder that true strength is often quiet and subtle but never invisible. The room, the evening, and the events had all shifted in meaning. The servant, by speaking with clarity and courage, had transformed not only the perception of himself, but also the awareness of everyone present. The billionaire had achieved a greater purpose than simple entertainment. He had created a space where integrity and insight were recognized and valued. And the servant, through observation, courage, and wisdom, had shown that respect, understanding, and influence are earned, not assumed. And so the night ended with a quiet, profound resonance. The lessons learned, the courage displayed, and the respect earned were not merely transient, they were enduring. The servant had demonstrated the quiet power of clarity and insight, reshaping perceptions and leaving a lasting impression on all who had witnessed it. The billionaire and the servant, in their shared understanding, had shown that true influence lies not in titles or wealth, but in knowledge, courage, and the ability to act with integrity when it matters most, and attentiveness that went beyond mere service. Guests noticed, and while some remained reserved, others acknowledged his presence with subtle nods or expressions of respect. It was not recognition for performance alone, but for the character revealed in the earlier moment, a recognition that intelligence and courage transcend social roles. As the night continued, the conversations began to touch on topics of substance. Guests discussed ideas, philosophies, and insights rather than trivialities. They referenced the earlier moment, though indirectly, in comments that praised honesty, integrity, and courage. The servant, moving quietly among them, could sense the change in the room. There was a tangible shift from pretense to authenticity, a subtle but meaningful evolution in the interactions between people who had previously been locked in social hierarchy. Even the billionaire's manner seemed slightly softened, though he retained his calm, commanding presence. He engaged with guests in ways that encouraged reflection and thoughtful discourse. His words were measured, deliberate, and intentionally left space for others to contribute meaningfully. The earlier silence, now replaced with intentional conversation, became a reminder that wisdom is often revealed in unexpected ways and by unexpected individuals. The ripple effect extended beyond conversation. Guests who had been quietly observing now became more attentive to one another, noticing nuances of expression and tone. Understanding that listening and comprehension carried value as much as speaking, they began to interact with a greater sense of empathy and awareness. It was clear that the room had internalized the lessons embedded in the moment when the servant spoke, though no one had announced it openly. The subtle transformation was visible in body language, in tone, and in the careful consideration of words before they were spoken. The servant remained grounded in his role, yet he had become a subtle point of reference. Guests understood that his presence was now more significant, not through force or declaration, but through quiet demonstration of knowledge, integrity, and composure. They had witnessed him navigate a moment that required both courage and wisdom, and the memory of that moment informed every subsequent interaction. By the end of the evening, the atmosphere was no longer one of tension or silent competition. There was a sense of unity, grounded not in wealth or status, but in shared recognition of intelligence, observation, and moral clarity. The lessons of humility and courage had been absorbed, and while they would manifest differently for each individual, the impact was undeniable. The room, once a stage for performance, had become a space for genuine engagement. As guests began to leave, many glanced at the servant with quiet admiration, acknowledging what had transpired without overt comment. The billionaire, too, observed the departing guests with satisfaction. The evening had achieved more than entertainment. It had revealed truths about character, courage, and insight. The subtle dynamics of respect had been reshaped, and the impact would linger far beyond the event itself. The servant returned to the quieter corners of the penthouse, attending to small duties with the same calm, steady presence he had always maintained. Yet the room now recognized him differently. The memory of his words, the courage to speak with clarity, and the wisdom conveyed had elevated his presence beyond the role of service. It was a demonstration of how intellect and moral courage can command respect and influence without overt power or status. The billionaire, concluding his remarks for the evening, left the room with a quiet smile, acknowledging the servant once more with a subtle nod. It was a moment of shared understanding, unspoken yet deeply felt, a recognition of insight, loyalty, and courage. The lessons of the evening were clear. Intelligence and integrity are often found in unexpected places, and true respect is earned through character rather than positio. And so, the ripple effect of that moment continued long after the formalities of the evening had ended. Conversations, behaviors, and perceptions had all shifted subtly but meaningfully. The room had been transformed by a single act of courage and clarity, and everyone present would carry the memory of that moment forward. The servant, quietly performing his duties, had left an indelible mark, demonstrating that wisdom, courage, and integrity are forces that resonate far beyond immediate recognition. shaping the hearts and minds of those who witnessed them. Umptions that their polite gestures and feigned understanding had been exposed as hollow. They had all been part of a performance that the servant had effortlessly transcended. And yet, despite the astonishment, there was a growing respect, even admiration, for the quiet figure who had spoken with such confidence and precision. The servant's words continued, calm and measured, addressing not just the immediate meaning of the billionaire's statement, but the deeper implications behind it. He spoke of responsibility, of integrity, of understanding the consequences of one's actions. He spoke not as someone trying to impress or gain favor, but as someone who had truly grasped the essence of the message. His insight was clear, his reasoning sound, and his courage undeniable. It was not simply language that had commanded attention. It was the intelligence, the clarity, and the moral weight behind the words. Guests began to exchange glances again, this time with a mixture of awe and humility. They had witnessed something remarkable, a demonstration of intellect and courage that transcended social expectations. Some nodded subtly, as if acknowledging a lesson they had learned too late. Others seemed lost in thought, reflecting on their assumptions and the realization that true understanding often comes from places they least expect. The servant had shown that wisdom is not bound by appearance or position, and that respect must be earned through knowledge and integrity. The billionaire's presence remained calm, but commanding. He did not interrupt the servant, did not signal approval with grand gestures, but his subtle nods and measured expression conveyed more than words could. There was a silent acknowledgement, a passing of quiet authority, a recognition that the servant's insight was of value. It was clear to everyone in the room that the balance of power had shifted, not through wealth or status, but through intelligence, courage, and moral clarity. As the servant concluded his words, the room remained still for a long moment. The silence was different now, filled not with tension or uncertainty, but with a sense of awe and reflection. The guests were forced to confront their assumptions, their biases, and their understanding of the social hierarchy within the room. They realized that the value of a person is not always visible, that the roles people play do not define their intellect, insight, or moral strength. The servant had demonstrated all of these qualities without seeking recognition, without demanding attention, and in doing so, had shifted the perception of everyone present. The billionaire spoke next, briefly in Arabic, responding to the servant's words. His tone was calm, appreciative, and quietly approving. The exchange was not lengthy, but it carried immense significance. The servant's words had been heard, understood, and respected, and the room, once filled with polite pretense and subtle tension, had transformed into a space where respect was earned, where insight and courage mattered more than appearances, and where one quiet voice had silenced a room full of assumed authority. The guests began to recover slowly, some attempting to resume conversation, though now with a sense of humility and reflection. The tension had shifted. It was no longer about trying to impress the billionaire or compete for attention. It was about understanding, observing, and learning. The lesson had been delivered with quiet precision. True insight and courage transcend social status, and respect is earned through understanding, honesty, and the willingness to speak when others remain silent. The servant returned to his duties, his movements as quiet and unassuming as before, yet the room could not forget what had just occurred. The impact of his words lingered in the air, a reminder of the power of knowledge, integrity, and the courage to act with clarity. Guests moved through the room with a newfound awareness, some exchanging subtle nods of respect, others reflecting in silence on the assumptions they had carried into the evening. And as the night continued, the billionaire and the servant shared a quiet, unspoken acknowledgement, a recognition of understanding and respect that did not require the approval of anyone else. The room had been silenced, but it had also been transformed. The dynamics had shifted, and the lesson was clear. Wisdom and courage are not measured by title or appearance, but by clarity, integrity, and the willingness to speak with honesty when the moment demands it. Subtle, almost invisible pressure that seemed to press on everyone at once. The billionaire's eyes scanned the crowd, calm and calculating. He did not hurry. There was no urgency in his tone. He was patient, knowing that eventually someone would reveal themselves by action or speech. The servant watched as well, his posture relaxed but his mind alert. He understood that this was a moment that required careful attention. He did not need to impress. He only needed to respond with honesty and clarity when the time came. Guests shifted uneasily, whispering among themselves. Some tried to guess at the meaning of the words. Some pretended to understand while others stared at the floor or at the ceiling, hoping that someone else would break the silence. The room was full of tension, a quiet storm that made the air feel heavier than it should have been. Yet amidst all this, the servant moved silently, his tray steady, his movements unobtrusive, his eyes never leaving the billionaire. As the minutes passed, the atmosphere became almost tangible, charged with expectation. The guests could feel it even if they could not name it. Something important was happening, something beyond their understanding of social etiquette or polite conversation. The servant felt it too, but with a different clarity. He understood the stakes and the opportunity that this moment presented, though he remained outwardly calm. The billionaire continued speaking, each phrase deliberate, measured, and pointed. It was clear that his words were more than just formalities or polite conversation. They carried meaning, a test of awareness and intellect. The guests struggled to keep up, nodding at appropriate intervals, smiling when others smiled, but inside, most of them were lost. They realized with growing unease that they were not in control. The billionaire was, and he was seeing through every pretense, every attempt at superficial understanding. The servant, on the other hand, felt a quiet confidence. He did not feel superior to the others. He simply understood more of what was happening. He had learned over the years that power often lay not in outward display but in insight, in observation, and in knowing when to act. This was a moment that demanded action, but only when it could be delivered with thought and precision. Guests began to exchange glances, some nervously, some with curiosity. There was a subtle realization that no one present had yet responded. The silence was no longer comfortable. It had become a mirror reflecting their uncertainty. The billionaire's calm presence made it even more pronounced, highlighting the contrast between those who understood and those who did not. The servant adjusted his tray, setting it aside for a moment, not out of disobedience, but because he sensed that something more important was about to occur. He stood quietly, his hands folded, his posture respectful yet ready. He had prepared for moments like this, not knowing exactly when they would come, but knowing that when they did, readiness mattered more than hesitation. The room seemed to stretch in time, the silence heavy with anticipation. The billionaire looked around, his gaze resting briefly on each guest. There were no signs of impatience or irritation, only a quiet expectation that someone would respond. The guests felt the pressure, realizing that this was not a game, not a casual gathering. It was a test, subtle yet unmistakable, and the outcome was uncertain. The servant felt a calm determination. He did not seek recognition, and he did not crave approval. He simply understood what was required. He knew that when the moment came, he would respond not with fear or hesitation, but with clarity, intelligence, and honesty. The room, unaware of the servant's preparedness, continued to hold its collective breath, waiting for someone to break the silence. This was the first part of the evening, the stage being set for an event that would challenge assumptions, reveal character, and show that true insight often comes from unexpected places. The guests were oblivious to the subtle lessons unfolding before them, caught up in appearances and etiquette, while the servant quietly prepared for a moment that would change the dynamic of the room forever. The air was thick with tension, the lights of the chandeliers reflecting off crystal and marble, and the city beyond the windows shining like a reminder that life outside the room continued, unaware of the quiet drama unfolding within. As the music faded into a soft background, and the billionaire's words continued, the room waited, suspended in that delicate balance between expectation and uncertainty. And the servant stood quietly, ready, knowing that when the moment arrived, he would be the one to speak, and what he said would silence the room in ways that no one could yet imagine.